Me and Elio are here today talking about designing a project and drafting a proposal, advice for critical researchers. And our particular focus is on the ESRC studentship, so it might not be relevant to everybody, but hopefully there'll be some stuff to take away for everyone. So in terms of looking at how to draft a successful proposal, we're going to run through a few things first. We'll begin with the context of the ESRC. Because we're political scientists, we look at the legislative sort of framework within which it sits. And in order to look at that, we're going to look at the UK research and innovation, which is a fun bit. And then we're going to basically have a brief overview of how a doctoral training centre will process your application. And there's going to be a lot of acronyms and DTCs and doctoral training, so if I stumble, please forgive me, but it's just difficult to say all of these words very quickly. Then we're going to look more precisely at the ESRC 1+3 studentship, in terms of what the ESRC are looking for, how to craft a potentially successful proposal, we would hope. And then we'll have a conclusion on, briefly on money and the nature of funding, which is the more critical bit, I suppose. Okay, so my bit to start with. As a political scientist, I always find it useful to look at, so the ESRC, just so you know, is the Economic Social Research Council. It is the council that I receive my funding from, so I'm going to say only positive things about the ESRC today, you can be sure of that. Basically, it's important to know what the nature of the beast is when you're making an application. You wouldn't go and apply for a job without knowing the conditions of the role or what kind of company you're applying for. And when you're applying for funding in the context of a PhD, you have to know what the ESRC is and where it comes from. So, in order to do so, I'm going to take you back to 2015, where there's the publication of the Nurse Review into Higher Education and the funding of science and research. In 2015, this report highlighted several supposed weaknesses of the state of science funding and research in the UK. It outlined what it called a lack of strategic join-up in terms of academic disciplines, the research base and policymakers. Furthermore, it found that there was a fragmented approach to investment, which hampered the development of interdisciplinary research, which is the new fad, and also what it identified as a historic weakness of commercialisation. Following this report was the publication of the white paper, Success as a Knowledge Economy, which became legislation in the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017. These reforms are important insofar as they have resulted in the creation of UK Research and Innovation, which is an arm's-length public body funded by granted aid and answerable to the Secretary of State for Business, Education and Industrial Strategy. The UKRI is headed by a chap called Mark Walport at the moment, who led the Wellcome Trust and was a senior advisor to the government on matters relating to science. And the board chair of UKRI is an ex-civil servant from the Treasury, just to give you a sort of idea as to what its nature is. So basically the UKRI replaces HEFCE and it goes in step with the OFC, Office for Students, OFS rather, Office for Students. And as a whole it is funded by the Treasury to the tune of around £6 billion, half of which is used to fund research grants and studentships via the research councils. Of course, the Treasury attaches conditionalities to this money. There's no such thing as free money. And its aims are essentially in establishing and funding the UKRI are to aid the industrial strategy of the UK through boosting productivity. Research and development are thus key to the newly organised UKRI, and its focus on productivity and growth will filter through to all the research councils in some form. So, I'll show you the little graphs of how things have changed. This is the old one. This is the new one. The old one, new one. So UKRI. There are 7 research councils under the umbrella of UKRI, with 2 other bodies, Innovate UK and Research England. The former focused on achieving economic growth and productivity through business partnerships, and the latter responsible for funding higher education institutions more generally. The ESRC is but one research council, and its strategies and aims tend to harmonise with the broader aims of UKRI. So, as the ESR states in its delivery plan for 2016 to 2020, we will deliver an ambitious programme of social science with direct benefit to the UK economy and society. And this basically manifests in the following commitments, which are taken from the ESRC delivery plan 2016 to 2020. As we can see, their main aims are to foster research and innovation, to create and maximise data infrastructure, to build capability, and this is where we come in with the doctoral training and funding for students doing PhDs, and facilitating partnerships and realising impact, the key watchword of academic work. So, basically, the reason I bring these up is of particular importance, because when you're framing an application for the ESRC, you want to take particular consideration of these main interests, which change in different periods depending on the delivery plan. So as we can see, mental health, housing, productivity, understanding the macroeconomy, climate change, innovation in health and social care, and trust in global governance in a turbulent age. You can see they're all kind of relevant to stuff you've probably read about that are ongoing, and they tend to fund stuff in this area. This is especially important for research grants, not just studentships, but it always helps to look at these. And their role, their aim in giving you a studentship is this. They want to create a strong cadre of leaders for the future. So you're going to be a leader, not just an academic, you must lead. And that is why they're paying you the money they are. So the reason I bring this up is basically to say you have to be aware of the key research areas that the ESRC are interested in. And the delivery plan is always a good place to start in looking for that. Another thing I would say is following the purse strings is always an effective means of assessing the nature of any organisation, no matter what it is. And when the money leads up to the Treasury, you can be sure that such money comes with priorities, which are often made to be consistent with a broader plan for the economy, which they are. These priorities must be examined and used by the critical scholar in order to frame research in a manner generally acceptable to the biases of the Research Council, thus improving chances of successful application. So I would basically just say be instrumental and look at what they want. So, again, to the UKRI. Much of the money allocated goes to the instrumental or natural sciences. So lots of money goes into physics and other sorts of things, with much less funding provided for the social sciences and the humanities. The pot of funding allocated to the ESRC, around 25% of that goes to building capacity or capability, and this includes the funding of studentships, which is the focus of what we're looking at today. It is this point where things become a little less prescriptive. So when you're applying for a studentship, it's less strict, let's say, than applying for a grant, which is dealt with more centrally. But when you're applying for a studentship, they're awarded by universities, not by the ESRC directly. But these universities must be accredited ESRC doctoral training centres. In the West Midlands, we have what's called a doctoral training partnership, which combines multiple centres across the region. And this has given a greater focus on regional partnerships. It's not uncommon today to find academics who work at both Warwick, or PhD students who work with academics at both Warwick and at Birmingham, for example. It is these more local and immediate bodies, designated research organisations, which administer the distribution of ESRC studentships for PhD researchers. There's therefore some decentralisation which allow respective universities to emphasise particular areas or pathways they wish to provide ESRC studentships for. This information is often available from the websites of the DTC, so if you want to check what they're looking at, if you want to see the pathways available, you can check online and they'll show you. However, what is unclear to us, and will be to you, even after you've researched the DTC, is the precise nature of the application process itself. What is clear, so what will be clear to you is how you apply and when you have to get what the deadlines are and what they expect to see of you. But what's unclear is how that's then processed. And also what's very unclear is the criteria employed, which often remains vague, at least for the applicant. What we've managed to figure out, and apologies for this poorly constructed diagram that I did earlier today, we found out mainly from talking to people who are involved in the process of, administering this funding. So we spoke to people involved in funding management at school and college levels, and from talking with these people, we have more of an insight regarding the manner in which applications for ESRC studentships are selected. In terms of the open competition for studentships, students will apply for a PhD in a particular pathway, and at a particular university. So I go to the University of Birmingham, I do political science, that's my pathway, that's my university. The Midlands Doctoral Training Partnership has around 17 pathways, which are across the disciplines in the social sciences. And once applications are made to a specific pathway, things called pathway panels or institutional pathway panels, made up of academic support and academics, will look at they'll look at the applications, select several of them, and then pass them up to the cross-institutional pathway panels, which are made up of pathway coordinators and people from across the different universities. These applications are then commented on, and those that are carried forward are passed on to a management committee, who again rescore the applications and provide comments. Then there's a large meeting of pathway coordinators at the end, and they all decide on which applications to award the money to. And then you hear about it and accepted. So, what is clear from this description, and what's important about it, is that the process of a single application will be read multiple times, and not always by persons intimately familiar with your academic field. Furthermore, many non-academic staff examine these applications, meaning that they must be able to speak to a diverse audience, or at least a relatively diverse audience. If an application is what we might call too academic, it is unlikely to appeal to or even make sense to a wider audience. The professionals examining applications are likely to employ a number of criteria in their assessment, meaning that any application will not be assessed purely on academic merit, but also on how it links up with the priorities of the Doctoral Training Centre, with the partnership, and with the central ESRC values and strategic orientations. So with this in mind, we will move on to examine in more detail how to construct a proposal for the 1+3 studentships offered by the ESRC, where Elio will run through the studentship, what it is, and how to approach crafting a proposal. Yeah.
Okay, so bear with us, we might run a little bit with time, but the advice is at the bottom, so it should cover most of the questions you might have. So the 1+3 studentship grants a scholarship towards fees and a stipend of around £14,000 per year for UK and EU applicants who have lived in Britain for longer than 3 years. These cover a mandatory master's degree in research methods, a 3-year PhD normally, several advanced methods courses, and finally internships, exclusive placement opportunities, and so on. Helpfully, it also comes with a minimum of £750 per year towards research costs, including presenting work at conferences, and it makes you eligible for a funded postdoc with the SRC once you're done. So the question on everyone's mind is probably going to be, how competitive is it? Well, experience tells us that to succeed, an applicant must demonstrate that they have found out exactly what the strategic priorities of the SRC are in the coming years, and must have integrated them integrated their understanding of them in their research design, rather than just paying lip service to them in your documents. As Darcy mentioned, there's a lot of self-explanatory guidance on the scholarship, for the process, and so on, so we'll limit ourselves exclusively to what you will not be told by anyone, including your supervisors, about the 1+3 studentship. The first thing you deserve to know is that you need to have a master's degree with a distinction for your application to be considered. Realistically, you probably also need a first-class degree to be among 1 or 2 winners in your subject area. The second thing you deserve to know is that the long-term pattern of the ESRC funding shows that it is being gradually replaced by an integrated higher education's loan system, including undergraduate, postgraduate, and PhD studies, which means you probably will be among the last generation to actually be able to apply to win this money. Now, around 300 people apply for 20 to 30 places per discipline. The success rate may seem very low if you crunch these numbers as such, but half of the applicants probably don't have a master's. And if your application is competitive because it does have one, the chances that you will make it into a regional shortlist of around 15 candidates is pretty good. So the real challenge is to be 1 of 2 winners among 15 competitors. But for this reason, the studentship is still worth considering as an option, but you have to bear in mind that you can probably earn a lot more doing a job, which is one of the reasons why most of the competition you're up against probably won't even apply, because the money is just going to be too little for them to do it. So what are they looking for? We believe you have to give them exactly what they want. However, as Darcy's just demonstrated, it's pretty hard to understand exactly what that is, and the ESRC is not so good at communicating it, especially not what is you meant to be reading between the lines. The first thing that they want is a guarantee that you'll finish on time. They have skeletons in the closet and they want us to sort it out. They used to give out scholarship that kept people working on their PhDs for too long, or was perceived to be for too long, without progressing in an academic career. So now they will only fund applicants that look like the only thing standing between them and having a successful academic career is that they won't have PhD funding. The first consequence of this is that your research proposal, your project, should be designed so as to scream out that it can actually be brought to completion with the chosen methods within 3 years. The questions that the panel are likely to ask themselves in this respect are, is the applicant serious about their studies? If we give them money, will they focus on their PhD without distraction, or will they be exploited by senior members of staff who ask them to do stuff on the side all the time, and so on? will the candidate be arranging a defense of their thesis 3 years from the start of the program? Is the project simple and modest enough that it can be carried out within this time? Hence, the worst thing you can do is be overly ambitious, because you won't be able to convince anyone, and especially not academics, that you can do things people cannot achieve on a full salary, let alone for a portion of that salary. Secondly, the panel will be looking for an application form and a CV that make you look like you want to be and are definitely going to be an academic that publishes regularly. The key word there is look like. Okay? The questions the panel are likely to ask themselves in this respect is, how can you be sure that we are paying to turn the candidate into an excellent academic as opposed to just a good citizen, which is what Darcy pointed out earlier in terms of trying to create leaders in the future. Does the candidate have their eyes on the prize? In other words, will they put themselves at their own interest before others by focusing on their PhD? Is this candidate going to do something academic with a PhD? In other words, how do we know that they are not just going to work for some company instead of becoming an asset for British universities? And then finally, what guarantee has the candidate given us that they're going to get a good academic job? In other words, are they definitely going to publish something during and after the PhD? Again, I want to stress that you just have to make it look like this is what you're going to do. You don't actually have to do it. Okay, so some further tips and advice on this. They clearly want to be treated as leaders in the business of training the next generation of professionals in the social sciences. So it might help to see the 1+3 studentship as analogous to the funding given the people to train to become teachers, doctors, and nurses, but for academia. In the application form, you might want to draft a research profile that includes everything you have written, presented, done independent research on, research assistantships, talks that you've organized, and so on. Try to demonstrate that there's a single logical thread between what you studied at universities, these activities that you might have undertaken, and the project that you're proposing. And finally, we recommend that you try to publish, and not just in student journals before you apply. And we recommend that a good place to start is a book review for a peer-reviewed journal in your field that you like. So these probably like 2 pages long, gets published relatively quickly, you get a free book out of it, and it looks good because it shows that you've gone through a peer review process. The ESRC is also always looking for people who can foster collaboration between research and civil society, but they're extremely vague about what this means. It can't quite be quantified at the doctoral level. So it's something that's being told to do by government, and as you might expect, it's another thing, another responsibility that they offloaded onto prospective candidates. So you might ask, what do I need to do to make my research seem like it's publicly accountable? And unsurprisingly, the ESRC interpret this civil duty incredibly instrumentally. Our advice would be that you do not make big promises about policy recommendations. The state does not make the ESRC funding available to PhD students to improve government practice. If they wanted to do that, they would just start listening to academics. So what we recommend instead is that the state makes the funding available to help create a class of elite academics, and they should just try to pander to that. You should try, therefore, to get, and this is key, a headed letter from an organization stating that your research will be of definite interest to them and that the ESRC should fund it because they, be they a charity or a social enterprise or otherwise, cannot fund it. This will allow the ESRC to tick a box, which they like. The easiest place to start in this respect is to find an organization that is tied to a research participant of yours or your case study. Now we have some advice for critical researchers to kind of dispel some of the, say, false assumptions that come along with the process, and are pretty reasonable assumptions you might make having found out how instrumental the whole thing is. If you're a critical researcher or do not work with numbers, do not be afraid. Critical thinking is a real quality. If you have it, you shouldn't shy away from showing it. It's absolutely not true the ESRC will only fund projects with statistical methods. They make more funding available for such projects, especially in economics, but you will not be made to compete against applicants outside of your subject area or pathway. So, if you're not a positivist, you don't use quantitative methods or you don't do statistics, do not use this language, the language of the natural sciences, to justify your project. If an interpretive project is to look academically rigorous, that it must deploy the appropriate language and contemporary methodological references for that particular design. The best place to look for the literature that they are likely to appreciate is the module handbooks for the ESRC accredited MA Research Methods courses at the university that you intend to apply to. Now, finally, what makes a successful proposal? It will mostly be read and judged by people who are not experts in your field. So this section must start with an accurate summary of what follows and serve to make the rest accessible to a reader in as plain possible language. So as a rule of thumb, I like to think that my family should be able to understand exactly what I'm proposing by reading the introductory paragraph and summary at the very top. You then move on to the aims and objectives, where you also have the research questions. The puzzle is the easiest way to start and to make your specific research area seem interesting to what might otherwise be an uninterested reader. State some hypotheses, which, if you will, are a bit like your expectations of what you're going to find or what you think you're likely to find. But as I've said, the most important part really are the research questions. They should follow logically from the hypotheses that you've just stated, but also link up to the issues that you're just about to identify in the following, which is the literature review, or as I've called it, also context or historical background, depending on the kind of research design that you have. This could be quite daunting because there's a lot to summarize and you don't really have that much space. So an easy way of structuring the review of your relevant literature is to use sources that provide the historical background of your project in the very first paragraphs. In the middle, you might want to move on to sources that provide the past and present state of the academic debate in your area. It should be geared, though, however, to emphasizing the potential to form a scholarly contribution to a publication, which could make you a potential candidate for an academic job. So don't spend too much looking at the intricacy of your field. Use only the ones that are instrumentally valuable. The theoretical framework is probably the easiest and shortest section, where you just identify a small and manageable problem with the approach and demonstrate how you're going to address it. So it's merely to demonstrate that you're basically not shying away from theory because you don't like it. The probably most important one, though, and the one that kind of makes it publicly accountable and worthy of the money, and the one that most candidates are likely to be weakest on, is the methodology. We recommend that you try to say everything there is to know about your research methods, but while keeping it simple. This section must give the reader the impression that you will complete your study during the funding period. It must also include a research design, and we recommend that you really don't blag this. You have to make reference to the mainstream methodology literature, which can be found in widely available textbooks or more advanced articles on research design and methodology. You can write this bit last, but you should begin researching it as soon as possible, especially when you first get your idea, which is something I didn't do. And I've noticed that leaving it too late seems to be the #1 reason why people don't meet the deadline and then have to defer their application to the following year. So readers may well, of course, be completely oblivious to your method, but the important thing is to give them the impression that you know what you're talking about. The reason for this is that most people will be applying with hugely ambitious projects that require interviewing an unrealistic number of people, who will in turn be asked to give up an unrealistic and completely ridiculous amount of their time. So describing the specifics of what you will do your project will make it look easier and address some of the fears the panel might have. If you're going to drive to London, as we would, I would just state, I will drive to London 4 times a year and collect all the data in 12 research days, because there's nothing better to sort of satisfy what they're looking for than that. And then finally, you'd have your intended research contribution, where you state what makes your research original. It should be a contribution to knowledge, such as adding new knowledge. It will become clearer as you progress, of course. But it's also where you should state where your ideas will be welcomed, such as by pointing to a journal or a research community that is reputable and will be interested in your work. Finally, include a chapter outline and a timetable, which again are purely there to make the project look like it's realistic and doable within the 3-year funding period. Okay, now move on to Darcy about the conclusions we have about this whole experience.
So quickly to end, I'm going to just go on a bit of a rant, basically. So today we've been discussing an apparently mundane, but nonetheless necessary aspect of academic life. Basically, we've been talking about the money. Where is it and how do I get it? And yes, while this might appear mundane, or as a frustrating obstacle in the way of richer intellectual pursuits, The mundanity serves to mask a fundamental violence implied by the process of successfully obtaining funding for a PhD. As a critical scholar, when looking at money, you see that it stands as a testament to the fact that we as researchers do not have free and common access to the means of producing academic work or to those of reproducing ourselves as human beings. We are fundamentally separated from these means, only united with them in and through money. Thus, the money tells us of a historic separation of persons from the means to their autonomy, and for the critical scholar, this is readily apparent not only in the wage relation, but also within the process of applying for money to pursue academic work. And as this money is the contemporaneous form of the separation of our means to autonomy, it is also a political separation, not simply an economic one. So the money given to research councils is given by the Treasury, meaning that any such public money comes with a constitutional duty to produce constructive knowledge for the recuperation and stabilisation of liberal democratic capitalist societies. So, when we're talking about the mundanity of money, we are also speaking of this historic violence which renders us free only to sell our labour power, as well as about the political service we are expected to owe to the state, which maintains and extends this separation. The state demands that their money be put to productive use in supporting, say, an industrial strategy for the nation. So when awarded ESRC money, you are enjoined, but you do not have to accept, to become a constitutional patriot, producing impact which will enable Britain and the liberal democratic world to overcome the problems they confront. What this reflection hopefully demonstrates is that money is neither historically nor politically neutral. Behind its mundane appearance, money hides the whole political economic life of capitalist society with all its violence and irrationality. In this way, the intellectual work of the critical scholar starts before any official scholarship has been paid for. That is, in comprehending and critiquing the social relations which necessitate our submission to the authority of state and of money. It is necessary to reflect on these dimensions of intellectual life, for sadly they are not separate from it, but in fact wholly constitutive of it. You will never be able to simply forget about the money, because its presence and absence will continually intervene throughout your entire academic career. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
We've run a little bit over. We have 5 minutes for a quick Q&A session, and then we can continue with questions later on. Yes.
So I just have a couple of questions. So the first one is, the presentation is based on your experience, or like the experience of others, and you know, collect the data and put it together here. The second one, I'm not really sure, because, well, I've done my PhD already, but there might be people here who are applying for PhDs. And what I feel from your presentation that I would like you to just clarify a bit more, because you've said a few times you need to make it look like, but actually the things you are saying is what is actually what an academic is. You know, you need to make it look like you're publishing. You actually need to be publishing. I think maybe you mean is we're too young to have a massive list of publications, and you need to show that you are engaged with, you know, writing and you will be publishing. Or is that what you mean? Because, you know, like that, I really know where you're coming from this terrible context of getting money and all that. But, you know, for like younger people and younger researchers, that's quite like, I don't know, it's not sad, it's the point of frustrating. So just if you could like share like a more positive note, if possible, if there is one, where we don't need to make it look like, because actually that's against critical research. You know, I'm a critical scholar, so that really hurts me when you say that we need to fake it through. Yeah, I would like to believe that as critical researchers we don't. And also, I really liked your final speech, Darcy, but can you just connect it to real life in the sense, okay, so what then? What do we, this is present, this is horrible, I need to pay my bills, I want to do my research, but I also need to pay my bills, feed my baby. So how does that connect like our real world? How do we put that in our research? Thank you.
Do you want to take the last one?
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'll take the last one.
I just thought it might be worth mentioning collaborative studentships. You mentioned it, but I think, you know, that's a really interesting way to go, and I think you kind of, you know, up your chances quite significantly if you're able to engage with an organisation that's doing interesting work that both wants to learn from what you're doing, and you can learn from them and bring that into academia. I think
Yeah, yeah.
So the collaborative studentships, unfortunately we had to cut that bit out. But if we put this down to something which is typed up and freely distributable, then yeah, we'll include that. Yes, you're right, there is more money available for that. And on jobs.ac.uk, universities and research teams will regularly put up adverts for projects which tend to be more critical than the ones I've found to get passed through the process that we've just described. But you also have to be lucky enough for them to be specifically in your research area. There is room for being creative, and from what I've been told, supervisors generally respect your right to take your project wherever you want. You get paid more though also because you might have extra additional responsibilities, but yes, I agree, they tend to be less competitive, so keep up to date with those. They're called collaborative studentships. These experiences, yeah, primarily ours, haven't gone through it, but also, you know, I think one of the things that is still true of PhD research, it is more collegiate than the rest of academia, so it is the experiences of a lot of people that we've talked to for the last couple of years. The question needing to publish, yes, I might agree, and I would probably stress that we should have said, maybe on a positive note, all the critical researchers we've known who have applied have got the funding, so there is cause for hope, if you know what I mean. Although I'm not sure how much that is true of Birmingham only, as opposed to the whole country. But I guess what we were trying to do here is demonstrate that you have a right to take this money if you want to do a PhD without becoming an academic afterwards. It's totally okay to do that. And that's something I think that, well, we probably haven't set our minds on, but I would definitely hope that people consider that. I personally don't like the fact that they seem to make it a condition of the funding that you must become an academic afterwards. So I think that was what the focus we were trying to make in the presentation was.
And I'll come back with the just two connected points. So I'll get to the real life one in a second. In terms of like the do we need to fake it? Kind of think you do to some extent. You need to fake it. Like I think every research grant or application has a bit of faking going on, and you've got to adopt a dual language, especially as critical scholars, where you don't actually buy into a lot of the stuff they want you to do. So you say, well, I need to do that in order to get the money so I can sneak something better in, or I can invite people in to come and talk about stuff that's cool or something. It's just like a character mask that you have to be conscious that you're wearing and then be critical of that fact. So I do think there's an element of faking it. And I think in order not to get really stressed out and upset about academia, you need to recognise that. Because a lot of people who take academia at face value get very upset when they realise it's devoid of a lot of the stuff they expect to find there. Whereas I'm saying, if you prepare for that, you might be less stressed out by the fact that it's been evacuated of most values, and it's mainly about, you know, instrumentalism and so forth. And in terms of the last bit, and how does it relate to real life? It is real life because, like we say, in order to sell yourself, in order to maintain your own existence, isn't a good thing whether you're an academic or anyone else. And what that serves to highlight is that instead of just having like an individualised academic approach to academic problems, we need to have like a political approach to higher education and to social relations more broadly, which is to say you can't do work properly if you're basically held hostage to money, and that, you know, excludes a lot of people. So it's basically trying to highlight how if money's allowed to dominate your experience as an academic, maybe as academics we need to start putting forward positive models to move away from that and to say, you know, subsistence shouldn't be an obstacle to doing academic work, which is basically saying maybe we should look at a public model for higher education that's free and is better funded, so that people, or even more than that, to be more optimistic. You know, as a Marxist, I consider there be a communistic way of organising higher education. That's a bit crazy to speak about that, but that's a possibility. And just highlighting how money really is, it's an everyday thing that people just take at face value, but it really is quite nasty, and people know that as you know, trying to support yourself. So it is real life, and we just need to not forget that that can be changed, and that it's not acceptable just because it is real life. Anyway, yeah, I hope that answers the question. Done?
Yeah.
Here we go.